The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Windsor Castle as King Charles III stood by the large window in his private study. His fingers traced the edge of an old photograph showing his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, receiving a formal bow from a young diplomat decades ago. The weight of recent conversations with palace advisors hung heavy on his mind. Charles had been monarch for over a year now, but certain aspects of royal protocol still felt foreign to him. Unlike his mother, who had grown accustomed to the formalities from a very young age, Charles sometimes found himself questioning traditions that had remained unchanged for centuries. The bowing tradition, in particular, had become a source of internal conflict for the new king. Just 3 days earlier, during a private dinner with close family members, his daughter-in-law Catherine had mentioned how uncomfortable some of their international guests seemed when required to bow or curtsy. She had observed this during several recent state visits, noting how some dignitaries appeared unsure about the proper protocol, while others seemed to struggle with the physical demands of the gesture. Charles remembered his own childhood, watching endless streams of visitors bow before his mother. As a young prince, he had accepted this as simply the way things were done. People bowed to the queen just as the sun rose in the east and set in the west. It was an unchanging fact of royal life. However, his perspective had shifted considerably over the decades, especially during his long years as heir apparent when he had more freedom to interact with people from all walks of life. The king walked slowly to his desk, where several thick folders contained correspondence from various Commonwealth nations. Many of these letters came from government officials and citizens who had expressed their thoughts about royal protocols. Some praised the maintenance of traditional ceremonies, viewing them as important links to history and culture. Others questioned whether such formalities remained relevant in the modern world. Charles opened one particular letter from a Canadian official who had attended a recent royal event. The writer described watching an elderly veteran struggle to bow properly due to arthritis in his knees, yet the man insisted on following protocol despite obvious discomfort. The image troubled Charles deeply. Here was a person who had served his country with distinction, now feeling obligated to endure physical pain simply to show respect. According to an ancient custom, another letter came from a young mother in Australia who had brought her disabled daughter to meet members of the royal family during their last visit. The woman wrote about her child's confusion when she could not perform a traditional curtsy due to her condition, and how this had made both mother and daughter feel excluded from what should have been a joyful occasion. These personal accounts weighed heavily on Charles's conscience. He had always prided himself on being a monarch who could connect with ordinary people, someone who understood their struggles and concerns. The idea that royal protocol might create barriers between him and his subjects ran counter to everything he hoped to achieve as king. The telephone on his desk rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was his private secretary informing him that several senior palace advisors had requested an urgent meeting to discuss upcoming state visits. Charles agreed to see them within the hour, though he suspected the conversation would revolve around the very issues that had been troubling him. As he prepared for the meeting, Charles reflected on conversations he had shared with his sons William and Harry over the years. Both had expressed their own concerns about certain royal traditions, though they approached the subject from different angles. William, as heir to the throne, understood the delicate balance between honoring tradition and adapting to contemporary expectations. Harry, even before stepping back from royal duties, had openly questioned whether some protocols served any meaningful purpose in the 21st century. Charles thought about his grandmother, the Queen Mother, who had often spoken about the importance of royal ceremonies in maintaining public respect for the monarchy. She had lived through tremendous social changes, from the end of empire to the digital age, yet had remained convinced that certain traditions provided stability and continuity in an ever-changing world. Her voice seemed to echo in his mind, reminding him of the responsibility he bore to preserve the institution for future generations. Yet Charles also remembered his great-uncle, Lord Mountbatten, who had encouraged him to think independently about his role and not simply accept things because they had always been done a certain way. Mountbatten had often said that the monarchy's strength lay in its ability to evolve while maintaining its essential character. This advice had shaped much of Charles's thinking throughout his life. The king looked out the window again, watching gardeners tend to the castle grounds with the same care their predecessors had shown for generations. Some traditions, he mused, continued because they served a genuine purpose and brought beauty or meaning to life. Others persisted simply through habit, long after their original significance had faded. A soft knock at the door announced the arrival of his advisors. Charles straightened his shoulders and walked toward the meeting room, knowing that the conversation ahead would be challenging. The palace staff had served the monarchy faithfully for decades, and many viewed any change to established protocol with deep suspicion. They would need to be convinced that modification did not mean abandonment of royal dignity. As he entered the room, Charles saw the familiar faces of his most trusted counselors. Their expressions suggested they were prepared for a difficult discussion. The king took his seat at the head of the polished oak table, aware that the decisions made in this room could influence royal protocol for generations to come. The senior advisor cleared his throat and began speaking about the logistics of upcoming state visits. But Charles found his mind wandering to the deeper questions that had been consuming his thoughts. How could the monarchy remain relevant and accessible while preserving the dignity and respect that had sustained it for over 1,000 years? Was it possible to honor both tradition and the genuine concerns of modern people who simply wanted to show their respect without physical discomfort or social awkwardness? These questions would define much of his reign, Charles realized. Unlike previous monarchs who had inherited relatively stable protocols, he faced the challenge of leading the institution through a period of rapid social change while maintaining public support and respect. The weight of this responsibility settled on his shoulders as the meeting began in earnest. The mahogany conference table gleamed under the soft lighting of the palace meeting room, as senior advisors spread documents and protocol manuals before King Charles. The atmosphere felt tense, with each person carefully measuring their words. Sir Edmund Hartwell, the most senior palace official, had served the royal family for over 30 years and approached any discussion of protocol changes with extreme caution. Charles listened patiently as Sir Edmund outlined the upcoming state visit from the President of South Korea. The detailed schedule included numerous formal ceremonies where traditional bowing and curtsying would be expected from various officials and dignitaries. The king found himself paying closer attention to these requirements than ever before, imagining how each person might feel about performing these ancient gestures. Lady Margaret Sinclair, the royal protocol specialist, presented a thick folder containing historical precedents for royal ceremonies. She spoke with obvious pride about maintaining traditions that stretched back centuries, emphasizing how these customs distinguished the British monarchy from other institutions around the world. Her voice carried a note of concern as she mentioned recent informal feedback from some diplomatic circles suggesting that certain countries found British royal protocol more demanding than others. Charles shifted uncomfortably in his chair as the discussion continued. He appreciated the dedication of his staff, but their focus on maintaining every detail of traditional ceremony seemed to miss the larger picture he had been contemplating. When Lady Margaret finished her presentation, the king decided to share some of his recent observations. He began by describing the letter from the Canadian veteran, carefully explaining how the man's struggle to bow properly had troubled him deeply. The room fell silent as Charles spoke about his growing awareness that royal protocol might sometimes create unnecessary barriers between the monarchy and the people it served. He emphasized that his concerns did not stem from any desire to diminish royal dignity, but rather from a wish to ensure that expressions of respect remained meaningful rather than burdensome. Sir Edmund's response was immediate and forceful. He argued that bowing and curtsying represented fundamental expressions of respect that had sustained the monarchy through countless challenges over the centuries. He worried that any relaxation of these protocols might be interpreted as a sign of weakness or diminished authority. The British people, he insisted, expected their monarch to maintain the dignity and formality that set the royal family apart from ordinary citizens. Lady Margaret supported this position, citing numerous examples of successful state visits where traditional protocols had been followed without difficulty. She pointed out that most international visitors understood and respected British customs, viewing their participation in royal ceremonies as an honor rather than a burden. She also mentioned that many Commonwealth nations specifically requested formal protocols during royal visits, seeing them as important connections to their shared history and culture. The king listened carefully to these arguments, recognizing the genuine concerns behind them. His advisors had devoted their careers to preserving royal traditions, and their expertise deserved serious consideration. However, Charles also felt compelled to share more of his evolving thoughts about the monarchy's role in contemporary society. He described his vision of a more accessible monarchy that could maintain its dignity while reducing unnecessary barriers between royalty and citizens. Charles spoke about his desire to ensure that people from all backgrounds could participate comfortably in royal events, regardless of their physical abilities or familiarity with formal protocols. He emphasized that showing respect for the crown should not require anyone to endure discomfort or embarrassment. The discussion grew more animated as other advisors joined the conversation. Some supported the king's concerns, sharing their own observations about guests who had seemed uncomfortable with traditional protocols. Others argued that modifying established customs could set dangerous precedents that might eventually undermine the monarchy's authority and mystique. Charles found himself thinking about his mother's approach to these issues during her long reign. Queen Elizabeth II had maintained traditional protocols throughout her 70 years on the throne, yet she had also demonstrated remarkable ability to adapt to changing circumstances when necessary. She had modernized many aspects of royal life while preserving the essential dignity of the crown. Perhaps, Charles thought, he could follow a similar path. The king asked his advisors to research how other constitutional monarchies handled similar issues. He wanted to understand how countries like Sweden, Denmark, and the Netherlands balanced tradition with accessibility. Were there examples of successful protocol modifications that had enhanced rather than diminished public respect for those royal families? Sir Edmund agreed to conduct this research, though his tone suggested skepticism about finding useful precedents. He reminded the king that the British monarchy held a unique position in world affairs, with responsibilities and expectations that differed significantly from smaller European royal families. Any changes to British royal protocol would be scrutinized intensely by media and public opinion around the globe. The meeting continued for another hour, with detailed discussions about specific ceremonies and their historical significance. Charles learned that some protocols had indeed evolved over time, though usually in response to practical necessities rather than philosophical considerations. For example, the length and complexity of certain ceremonies had been modified to accommodate television coverage and international media attention. As the discussion wound down, Charles realized that any changes to bowing traditions would require careful planning and extensive consultation. The palace staff would need time to research precedents, consider alternatives, and develop proposals that could maintain royal dignity while addressing his concerns about accessibility. This would not be a quick or simple process. The king also understood that his advisors' caution came from genuine dedication to the monarchy's welfare. They had witnessed how even small changes to royal protocol could generate intense public debate and media speculation. Their protective instincts, while sometimes frustrating, reflected their deep commitment to preserving the institution they had served so faithfully. Before ending the meeting, Charles asked his staff to begin identifying upcoming events where modified protocols might be tested carefully. He wanted to explore possibilities gradually, learning from each experience before making broader changes. This approach might help address his concerns while minimizing risks to royal dignity and public perception. The advisors exchanged glances as they gathered their documents, clearly uncertain about the direction these discussions might take. Charles could sense their anxiety, but he also felt increasingly certain that the monarchy needed to evolve thoughtfully to remain relevant and respected in the modern world. The challenge would be finding the right balance between honoring tradition and embracing necessary change. 3 weeks after the pivotal meeting with his advisors, King Charles found himself reviewing research reports that had arrived from various Commonwealth nations and European monarchies. The thick manila folders spread across his private study desk contained fascinating insights into how different royal families approached ceremonial protocols in the 21st century. The Swedish monarchy had particularly caught his attention. King Carl XVI Gustav had successfully modernized many court ceremonies while maintaining public respect and constitutional authority. The Swedish approach emphasized dignity through simplicity rather than elaborate ritual, and public opinion polls consistently showed strong support. for their royal family's accessible style. Charles picked up a detailed report about a recent Swedish state dinner where guests had been instructed simply to stand respectfully when the king entered, rather than perform traditional bows or curtsies. The event had proceeded smoothly, with international visitors expressing appreciation for the relaxed atmosphere that still conveyed appropriate respect for the crown. A soft knock interrupted his reading. Queen Camilla entered the study, carrying a cup of tea and wearing the thoughtful expression that indicated she had been considering the same issues that occupied his mind. She had observed the recent tensions surrounding protocol discussions and had formed her own opinions about potential changes. Camilla settled into the comfortable chair across from his desk and began sharing observations from her own royal engagements. She described meeting a young girl with cerebral palsy during a recent charity visit, and how the child's parents had spent weeks worrying about whether their daughter could manage a proper curtsy. The family's anxiety had overshadowed what should have been a joyful occasion, and Camilla had found herself wishing there were simpler ways for people to show their respect. The Queen also mentioned conversations with international dignitaries, spouses during informal moments at state functions. Several had privately expressed relief when protocol requirements were relaxed, sharing stories about their own struggles with unfamiliar customs or physical limitations that made traditional gestures difficult. These personal accounts reinforced Charles's growing conviction that change was necessary. Charles shared some of the research findings with his wife, explaining how the Danish royal family had gradually modified their approach to formal ceremonies over the past 2 decades. Crown Prince Frederick had been particularly influential in developing protocols that maintained royal dignity, while reducing physical demands on guests and dignitaries. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Prince William, who had requested a private discussion about upcoming royal engagements. William brought his own perspective as a younger member of the royal family who regularly interacted with diverse groups of people through his charitable work and official duties. William shared his experiences, from recent visits to schools and community centers, where children and staff often seemed more focused on executing proper curtsies and bows than on enjoying their interactions with royalty. He had noticed that younger people, in particular, sometimes appeared confused or uncomfortable with traditional protocols, especially those from different cultural backgrounds who were unfamiliar with British customs. The prince also described his observations during international tours, where local officials sometimes struggled with protocol requirements while trying to maintain their own cultural dignity. He had witnessed awkward moments when traditional British customs clashed with local practices, creating tension rather than the mutual respect that royal visits were intended to foster. Charles listened carefully to his son's insights, recognizing how William's extensive public engagement work provided valuable perspectives on contemporary attitudes toward royal protocol. The younger generation's approach to respect and formality differed significantly from previous eras, and the monarchy needed to understand these changes to remain relevant. The 3 family members spent considerable time discussing potential alternatives to traditional bowing and curtsying. They explored ideas ranging from simple respectful standing to brief nods of acknowledgement, considering how different approaches might work in various ceremonial contexts. Each option required careful analysis of its symbolic meaning and practical implementation. Camilla suggested that any changes should be introduced gradually, perhaps beginning with less formal events before extending to major state occasions. This approach would allow the royal family to gauge public reaction and refine their methods before making dramatic modifications to well-established ceremonies. William proposed consulting with younger members of the Commonwealth Diplomatic Corps, whose insights might help identify protocols that could enhance rather than complicate international relations. He believed that making royal ceremonies more accessible could actually strengthen the monarchy's global influence by demonstrating sensitivity to diverse cultural backgrounds and physical abilities. Charles found himself increasingly convinced that thoughtful evolution of royal protocol could benefit both the monarchy and the people it served. However, he also recognized the need for extensive planning and consultation before implementing any significant changes. The royal family's actions were scrutinized intensely by media and public opinion, making careful preparation essential. The conversation turned to specific upcoming events where modified protocols might be tested discreetly. A private audience with disability rights advocates was scheduled for the following month, which could provide an excellent opportunity to experiment with alternative approaches to ceremonial respect. The relatively small, informal setting would allow for careful observation of how different protocols affected the overall atmosphere and participants' comfort levels. Charles also mentioned his interest in consulting with historians and constitutional experts about the legal and symbolic implications of protocol changes. While bowing and curtsying were primarily ceremonial rather than legal requirements, any modifications needed to maintain the constitutional dignity of the crown while enhancing its accessibility. As the family discussion continued, Charles felt increasingly optimistic about finding solutions that could satisfy both traditionalists and those seeking modernization. The key would be developing approaches that preserved the essential meaning of royal ceremonies while removing unnecessary barriers to participation and comfort. William suggested reaching out to Commonwealth youth leaders for their perspectives on royal protocol and its relevance to younger generations. Their insights could help ensure that any changes would enhance rather than diminish the monarchy's connection with future citizens and leaders. The conversation concluded with agreement to proceed carefully but purposefully toward meaningful reform. Charles felt energized by his family's support and their shared commitment to ensuring the monarchy remained both dignified and accessible. The challenge ahead would be translating these principles into practical changes that could withstand public scrutiny while achieving their intended goals of greater inclusivity and comfort for all participants in royal ceremonies. The first test of modified royal protocol came sooner than expected when an emergency arose during a scheduled audience with representatives from several disability rights organizations. Charles had been looking forward to this meeting as an opportunity to explore alternative approaches to ceremonial respect, but he had not anticipated that circumstances would force immediate improvisation. Lady Sarah Matthews, a prominent advocate who used a wheelchair due to spinal cord injury, had been scheduled to attend the audience along with 5 other disability rights leaders. However, on the morning of the meeting, 2 additional advocates arrived unexpectedly, including a young man with severe arthritis, who walked with considerable difficulty, and an elderly woman who had recently undergone hip replacement surgery. Sir Edmund Hartwell approached the king just minutes before the audience was scheduled to begin, his usual composure clearly strained. Traditional protocol required all guests to bow or curtsy upon meeting the monarch, but it had become obvious that several attendees would experience significant discomfort or physical impossibility in attempting these gestures. Charles made a split-second decision that would later be seen as a pivotal moment in royal protocol evolution. He instructed Sir Edmund to inform all guests that they should simply stand respectfully when introduced, without any requirement for bowing or curtsying. The king emphasized that their presence and advocacy work represented the highest form of respect for the crown's commitment to serving all citizens. When Charles entered the audience chamber, he was struck by the relaxed atmosphere that immediately developed. Instead of the usual tension that accompanied formal presentations, the disability advocates appeared comfortable and focused on the substantive issues they had come to discuss. Lady Sarah Matthews later described the experience as transformative, noting how the absence of protocol, anxiety had allowed genuine dialogue to flourish. The conversation that followed proved to be one of the most engaging and productive audiences Charles had conducted since becoming king. The advocates spoke candidly about barriers that prevented disabled people from fully participating in society, and they offered specific suggestions for how royal events could become more inclusive without losing their dignity or significance. One particularly moving moment came when James Morrison, the young man with arthritis, thanked the king for eliminating what he described as his greatest source of anxiety about the meeting. James explained that he had spent weeks worrying about whether he could manage a proper bow, and this concern had overshadowed his excitement about discussing important policy issues with the monarch. Charles found himself deeply moved by these personal testimonies, recognizing how his decision to modify protocol had removed genuine barriers to meaningful interaction. The advocate's relief and gratitude confirmed his growing conviction that ceremonial respect should enhance rather than complicate human connection. Following the audience, Charles immediately requested a private meeting with his senior advisors to discuss what had occurred and its implications for future events. Sir Edmund's initial resistance to the protocol change had clearly softened after witnessing the positive atmosphere it had created, though he remained concerned about broader applications of such modifications. Lady Margaret Sinclair raised important questions about consistency and precedent. If protocol could be modified for disability advocates, how would the palace handle requests for similar accommodations from other groups? She worried about creating a system where different rules applied to different audiences, potentially leading to confusion or accusations of favoritism. Charles acknowledged these concerns, while emphasizing that the goal was not to abandon protocol but to ensure it served its intended purpose of facilitating respectful interaction rather than creating obstacles. He proposed developing a more flexible approach that could adapt to circumstances while maintaining the essential dignity of royal ceremonies. The king asked his staff to begin documenting the specific elements of royal protocol that were truly essential versus those that were primarily traditional habit. This analysis would help identify areas where modifications could enhance rather than diminish the effectiveness of royal ceremonies. Over the following days, Charles received unexpected feedback about the disability advocates' audience from various sources. News of the modified protocol had spread through diplomatic and media circles, generating considerable discussion about the future direction of royal ceremonies. Several international ambassadors privately expressed interest in similar approaches for their own upcoming audiences, particularly those representing countries with large elderly populations or different cultural traditions around formal gestures. The Canadian High Commissioner specifically mentioned how such flexibility could improve the experience for Indigenous leaders who had their own protocols for showing respect. However, Charles also became aware of criticism from traditionalist quarters. Some members of Parliament and royal commentators argued that modifying established protocols, even for worthy causes, could set dangerous precedents that might eventually undermine the monarchy's authority and mystique. The king found himself carefully balancing these competing perspectives while trying to determine the best path forward. He recognized that any systematic changes to royal protocol would require extensive consultation and gradual implementation to maintain public confidence and institutional stability. An unexpected ally emerged in the form of his aunt, Princess Anne, who had built a reputation as one of the hardest-working members of the royal family. Anne had observed the disability advocates' audience and privately shared her own experiences with protocol, challenges during international visits and charitable engagements. Princess Anne described situations where rigid adherence to traditional ceremonies had created awkward or uncomfortable moments that detracted from the event's intended purposes. She supported her brother's interest in developing more flexible approaches, provided they maintained appropriate dignity and could be applied consistently. The princess offered to work with palace staff in identifying specific royal engagements where modified protocols might be tested further, drawing on her extensive experience with diverse public events and charitable activities. Her support carried significant weight within royal circles, given her reputation for practical wisdom and unwavering dedication to royal duties. Charles also received encouragement from an unexpected source when Archbishop of Canterbury contacted the palace to express support for making royal ceremonies more inclusive. The Archbishop noted parallels between the King's protocol concerns and the Church of England's own efforts to ensure that religious services remained accessible to people with diverse physical abilities and cultural backgrounds. This religious perspective added another dimension to Charles's thinking about the relationship between ceremonial dignity and practical accessibility. If the established church could adapt its ancient rituals to serve contemporary needs while preserving their spiritual significance, perhaps the monarchy could achieve similar evolution in its own ceremonial practices. As Charles reflected on the events surrounding the disability advocates' audience, he realized that his impromptu decision to modify protocol had opened a door that could not easily be closed. The positive response from participants and observers suggested genuine appetite for thoughtful reform, but the complexity of implementing broader changes was becoming increasingly apparent. The aftermath of the disability advocates' audience continued to reverberate through royal circles as Charles prepared for a much larger test of modified protocol. A state visit from the President of Ireland was scheduled for the following month, and this event would involve hundreds of participants, extensive media coverage, and the full attention of diplomatic observers from around the world. Charles spent several evenings in his study, carefully reviewing every aspect of the planned Irish state visit. Unlike the relatively private audience with disability advocates, this occasion would unfold under intense public scrutiny, with every gesture and departure from tradition subject to immediate analysis by constitutional experts, media commentators, and foreign diplomats. The Irish president, Michael Higgins, was known for his scholarly approach to history and his interest in cultural evolution. During preliminary discussions through diplomatic channels, President Higgins had expressed curiosity about the British monarchy's approach to ceremonial protocol, noting Ireland's own journey in developing state ceremonies that honored tradition while reflecting contemporary values. Queen Camilla joined Charles in planning sessions, bringing her perspective from numerous state visits she had attended both as queen and previously as duchess. She had observed how international guests sometimes struggled with British protocol requirements, and she strongly supported careful experimentation with more accessible approaches. The couple decided to propose a graduated approach to the Irish state visit, where traditional protocols would be maintained for the most formal elements, while allowing greater flexibility during less ceremonious interactions. This strategy would permit observation of how different approaches affected the overall atmosphere and effectiveness of royal diplomacy. Sir Edmund Hartwell had spent weeks consulting with protocol experts from other Commonwealth nations and European monarchies, gathering insights about successful ceremonial modifications. His research revealed that several royal families had indeed evolved their practices over recent decades, generally with positive results for public engagement and international relations. The most encouraging example came from the Netherlands, where King Willem-Alexander had introduced simplified greeting protocols that maintained royal dignity while reducing physical demands on participants. Dutch state visits now featured respectful standing rather than elaborate bowing, and this change had enhanced rather than diminished the effectiveness of royal ceremonies. Lady Margaret Sinclair remained more cautious, expressing concern about media reaction to any visible departures from established British traditions. She pointed out that royal protocol changes would inevitably be interpreted as political statements, regardless of their intended purpose, and could become subjects of partisan debate that might damage the monarchy's constitutional neutrality. Charles appreciated these warnings, while remaining convinced that thoughtful evolution was necessary for the monarchy's long-term effectiveness. He decided to arrange private consultations with former prime ministers and senior constitutional scholars to gather perspectives on the political implications of protocol modifications. The conversations with former political leaders proved illuminating. Several expressed support for making royal ceremonies more inclusive, noting that such changes could strengthen rather than weaken the monarchy's relationship with diverse communities within the United Kingdom and Commonwealth nations. However, they also emphasized the importance of presenting any modifications as natural evolution rather than dramatic reform. The key would be demonstrating that changes enhanced traditional values of respect and dignity rather than abandoning them in favor of modern informality. Prince William became increasingly involved in planning the Irish state visit, offering insights from his own diplomatic experiences and his understanding of contemporary public attitudes. He suggested consulting with young diplomats and junior civil servants who would participate in the visit, gathering their perspectives on how protocol modifications might affect their ability to represent Britain effectively. These consultations revealed interesting generational differences in attitudes toward royal ceremony. Younger diplomatic staff generally expressed enthusiasm for more flexible approaches, viewing them as evidence of the monarchy's ability to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining its essential character. However, more senior diplomats worried about international perceptions of British resolve and traditional authority. They argued that other nations expected Britain to maintain its distinctive ceremonial traditions, and that modifications might be interpreted as signs of declining confidence or cultural uncertainty. Charles found himself balancing these competing perspectives while trying to develop an approach that could satisfy both traditionalists and reformers. The Irish state visit would provide a crucial test of whether such balance was achievable in practice. 3 weeks before the visit, Charles made a decision that surprised even his closest advisors. He requested a private telephone conversation with President Higgins to discuss the protocol questions directly, seeking the Irish leader's perspective on how ceremonial modifications might affect the diplomatic effectiveness of their meetings. President Higgins responded with enthusiasm and insight, sharing Ireland's own experiences in developing state ceremonies that honored Celtic traditions while accommodating international diplomatic requirements. He expressed particular interest in exploring approaches that could reflect the evolving relationship between Britain and Ireland while maintaining appropriate ceremonial dignity. The conversation proved to be a turning point in Charles's thinking about royal protocol. President Higgins suggested that ceremonial innovation could actually strengthen diplomatic relationships by demonstrating mutual respect for different cultural approaches to formality and tradition. Following this discussion, Charles felt increasingly confident about proceeding with carefully planned modifications to the Irish state visit protocol. He instructed his staff to develop detailed proposals that would maintain the essential dignity of state ceremonies while introducing greater flexibility in personal interactions between royal family members and their Irish guests. The planning process revealed unexpected opportunities for innovation. Traditional state banquet seating could be modified to facilitate easier conversation between guests and hosts. Receiving line protocols could be streamlined to reduce physical demands while maintaining appropriate ceremonial respect. Garden party interactions could emphasize genuine engagement over rigid formality. As preparations intensified, Charles realized that the Irish state visit would likely establish precedents that would influence royal protocol for years to come. The stakes were high, but so was the potential for positive transformation of how the British monarchy engaged with international partners and its own citizens. The king spent his final planning session reviewing every detail of the proposed modifications, ensuring that each change served a clear purpose of enhancing rather than diminishing the ceremonial effectiveness of royal diplomacy. He felt a mixture of excitement and anxiety about the upcoming test of his evolving vision for accessible monarchy that could maintain its dignity while embracing necessary change. Media speculation about potential protocol changes had begun appearing in newspapers and social media, adding another layer of complexity to the planning process. Charles recognized that the success or failure of the Irish state visit modifications would likely determine whether his broader protocol reform agenda could proceed or would need to be abandoned in favor of traditional approaches. The morning of the Irish state visit dawned crisp and clear, with autumn sunlight streaming through the windows of Buckingham Palace as final preparations reached their climax. King Charles stood in his private dressing room, adjusting his ceremonial uniform while contemplating the significance of the day ahead. Every decision made during the next 48 hours would likely influence royal protocol for decades to come. Queen Camilla joined him in reviewing the carefully planned modifications that would be implemented throughout the visit. The most significant change involved the official greeting ceremony, where President Higgins and his wife would be welcomed with respectful standing, rather than traditional bowing requirements for accompanying dignitaries. This modification had been explained to all participants as reflecting contemporary diplomatic practice while maintaining appropriate ceremonial dignity. The first test came earlier than expected when the Irish delegation's advance team arrived for final coordination meetings. Several junior Irish officials appeared visibly relieved when informed about the relaxed greeting protocols, and their positive reaction reinforced Charles's confidence in the planned approach. Sir Edmund Hartwell, despite his initial reservations, had worked diligently to ensure that all modifications were implemented smoothly. He had briefed palace staff extensively about the new procedures, emphasizing that changes were designed to enhance rather than diminish the dignity of royal ceremonies. His professional dedication helped maintain staff confidence during this period of significant adjustment. The official arrival ceremony proceeded flawlessly, with President Higgins and his delegation expressing genuine appreciation for the thoughtful balance between formal respect and personal accessibility. The president later commented privately to Charles that the modified protocols had created an atmosphere conducive to meaningful diplomatic engagement rather than ceremonial anxiety. Media coverage of the arrival ceremony was largely positive, with royal correspondents noting the relaxed yet dignified atmosphere that characterized the interactions between British and Irish participants. Several commentators observed that the modifications seemed to enhance, rather than detract from the ceremonial significance of the occasion. However, Charles also became aware of criticism from certain quarters, particularly among traditionalist members of Parliament and some royal historians who expressed concern about precedents being established. These critics argued that any departure from established protocol, regardless of its immediate success, could lead to gradual erosion of royal authority and mystique. The state banquet that evening provided another opportunity to test modified approaches to royal ceremony. Traditional receiving line procedures were streamlined to allow for more meaningful personal interactions between royal family members and their Irish guests, while maintaining appropriate ceremonial dignity throughout the proceedings. Charles found himself particularly moved by the interaction between Queen Camilla and Mrs. Sabina Higgins, who had been experiencing mobility challenges following recent surgery. The modified protocol allowed for a comfortable exchange that focused on substantive conversation, rather than ceremonial choreography, creating a moment of genuine diplomatic connection. Prince William and Catherine participated actively in the evening's events, demonstrating how younger royals could embrace protocol modifications while maintaining their constitutional dignity. Their natural ease with the new approaches helped validate Charles's belief that evolution was necessary for the monarchy's continued relevance. The most significant moment came during President Higgins's formal toast, when he specifically acknowledged the British royal family's efforts to ensure that ceremonial traditions enhanced rather than complicated international friendship. His public recognition of the protocol modifications provided important diplomatic validation for Charles's reform agenda. Following the state banquet, Charles received immediate feedback from various diplomatic sources. The Irish ambassador to Britain expressed enthusiasm about how the modified protocols had facilitated genuine engagement between the two nations' representatives, while several other Commonwealth ambassadors privately inquired about whether similar approaches might be adopted for their own upcoming royal engagements. The second day of the state visit included a garden party at Windsor Castle, where hundreds of guests would interact with royal family members in a less formal setting. This event provided an excellent opportunity to observe how protocol modifications worked with larger, more diverse groups of participants. Charles was particularly interested in watching interactions between elderly guests and royal family members, having been concerned about the physical demands that traditional protocols placed on older participants. The modified approach allowed for comfortable exchanges that emphasized respect and engagement rather than ceremonial performance. Several disability rights advocates who had attended the earlier audience were invited to the garden party, and their presence provided continuity between Charles's initial protocol experiments and the broader state visit modifications. Their obvious comfort and engagement validated the king's conviction that accessibility and dignity could coexist successfully. The garden party also included representatives from various cultural communities within Britain, and Charles observed how the relaxed protocols seemed to facilitate more natural interactions between royal family members and guests from diverse backgrounds. Traditional bowing and curtsying requirements had sometimes created cultural confusion, but the modified approaches appeared more universally accessible. As the state visit concluded, Charles felt increasingly confident that his protocol reforms were achieving their intended goals of maintaining royal dignity while enhancing accessibility and genuine engagement. The positive reactions from participants, media coverage, and diplomatic observers suggested that thoughtful evolution was indeed possible. However, he also recognized that the Irish state visit represented only the beginning of a longer process of institutional change. Each future royal engagement would require careful consideration of how protocol modifications could be applied appropriately to different circumstances and cultural contexts. Prince William approached his father during the final reception, expressing his own observations about how the modified protocols had affected the overall atmosphere of the state visit. The younger prince noted that guests had seemed more relaxed and engaged throughout the various events, suggesting that the changes had achieved their intended purpose of facilitating rather than complicating meaningful interaction. Charles also received encouraging feedback from Queen Camilla, who had observed numerous positive reactions from female guests who had appreciated the reduced emphasis on perfect ceremonial performance. Many had expressed relief at being able to focus on substantive conversation rather than worrying about protocol execution. As the Irish delegation departed, President Higgins personally thanked Charles for the thoughtful approach to ceremonial protocol, noting how the modifications had contributed to the diplomatic success of the visit. This official validation from a respected international leader provided crucial support for Charles's broader reform agenda. The king returned to his study that evening with a profound sense of accomplishment, recognizing that the Irish state visit had demonstrated the possibility of evolving royal protocol without sacrificing institutional dignity or effectiveness. The challenge ahead would be systematically applying these lessons to future royal engagements, while maintaining public confidence in the monarchy's continuing relevance and authority. 6 months after the successful Irish state visit, King Charles found himself in a position he had hardly dared to imagine when his protocol concerns first began. The modifications introduced during President Higgins's visit had been so well received that similar approaches were now being requested by diplomatic missions from around the world. And public opinion polls showed overwhelming support for the monarchy's more accessible approach to ceremonial traditions. The king sat in his Windsor Castle study, reviewing letters and messages that had arrived from across the Commonwealth and beyond. The Prime Minister of Canada had specifically requested modified protocols for an upcoming royal tour, noting that Indigenous communities had expressed enthusiasm for approaches that could accommodate their own cultural traditions alongside British ceremonial requirements. Similarly, the Australian Governor-General had written to express support for protocol modifications that could make royal visits more inclusive for citizens with disabilities and those from diverse cultural backgrounds. These official endorsements from major Commonwealth nations provided crucial validation for Charles's reform agenda. Perhaps most significantly, Charles had received a personal letter from the Secretary-General of the Commonwealth, praising the British monarchy's leadership in developing ceremonial approaches that honored traditional dignity while embracing contemporary values of accessibility and inclusion. This international recognition suggested that the protocol changes were being viewed as positive innovation rather than abandonment of important traditions. Queen Camilla joined Charles in his study, bringing tea and her own collection of feedback from recent royal engagements. She had become an enthusiastic advocate for the modified protocols, having observed firsthand how they enhanced rather than diminished the effectiveness of royal ceremonies and public interactions. Camilla shared stories from a recent visit to a nursing home, where elderly residents had been able to engage comfortably with royal family members without worrying about physical demands of traditional bowing or curtsying. The relaxed atmosphere had allowed for meaningful conversations about residents' life experiences and community contributions, creating memories that honored both the individuals and the monarchy's commitment to serving all citizens. Prince William arrived for a scheduled discussion about implementing protocol modifications across all royal family activities. His own experiences with the new approaches had been overwhelmingly positive, and he brought specific proposals for extending them to youth-focused events, charitable engagements, and international tours. William described a recent school visit where students from various cultural backgrounds had interacted naturally with royal family members, without the confusion and anxiety that traditional protocols sometimes created among young people unfamiliar with British customs. Teachers had reported that students were able to focus on educational opportunities rather than ceremonial performance, resulting in more meaningful learning experiences. The prince also shared feedback from military personnel who had participated in recent royal events. Contrary to some predictions, service members had expressed appreciation for modifications that maintained appropriate respect while reducing unnecessary formality that could interfere with genuine recognition of their service and sacrifice. Charles listened with growing satisfaction as his family members described positive outcomes from protocol modifications across diverse settings and communities. The evidence was mounting that thoughtful evolution of royal ceremonies could strengthen rather than weaken the monarchy's relationship with the people. Sir Edmund Hartwell requested a private meeting to discuss the systematic implementation of protocol changes across all royal activities. His initial resistance had completely transformed into professional enthusiasm as he witnessed the positive effects of the Modifications on royal effectiveness and public engagement. Sir Edmund presented a comprehensive proposal for codifying the new approaches into formal palace guidelines that could ensure consistency while maintaining flexibility for different circumstances. This institutional framework would provide clear direction for staff, while allowing adaptation to specific cultural contexts and accessibility requirements. The proposal included training programs for palace staff, diplomatic briefings for international visitors, and public communication strategies to help citizens understand how the changes enhanced, rather than diminished, royal traditions. Sir Edmund's thorough professional approach helped ensure that the modifications would be implemented systematically, rather than improvised on a case-by-case basis. Lady Margaret Sinclair, once the most cautious voice regarding protocol changes, had become an advocate for documenting the historical significance of the monarchy's evolution. She proposed creating official records that would help future generations understand how and why traditional ceremonies had been modified to serve contemporary needs while preserving their essential dignity and meaning. Charles approved all these proposals, recognizing that successful institutional change required careful documentation and systematic implementation. The monarchy's approach to protocol modification could serve as a model for other institutions, seeking to balance tradition with accessibility and inclusion. The Maiders King also decided to commission a comprehensive study of public opinion regarding the protocol changes, wanting to ensure that the positive feedback he had received accurately reflected broader citizen attitudes. The results, when they arrived several weeks later, exceeded his most optimistic expectations. Polling data showed that over 80% of British citizens supported the modified royal protocols, with particularly strong approval among younger demographics, disabled communities, and ethnic minorities. International opinion was similarly positive, with citizens of Commonwealth nations expressing appreciation for the monarchy's adaptive leadership. Perhaps most significantly, the study found that public respect for the royal family had actually increased following the protocol modifications, contradicting predictions that changes would diminish royal authority or mystique. Citizens appreciated the monarchy's responsiveness to contemporary values while maintaining its constitutional dignity and historical continuity. As Charles reflected on the remarkable transformation that had occurred over the past year, he felt profound gratitude for the courage to question established practices and the wisdom to implement changes thoughtfully. The bowing tradition had not been abandoned but rather evolved to serve its true purpose of facilitating respectful engagement rather than creating barriers to meaningful interaction. The king realized that his emotional journey regarding royal protocol had taught him important lessons about leadership and institutional change. Sometimes preserving the essence of tradition required modifying its external forms, and genuine respect for the monarchy could be enhanced rather than diminished by making royal ceremonies more accessible to all citizens. Looking toward the future, Charles envisioned a monarchy that could continue evolving thoughtfully while maintaining its constitutional role and historical significance. The protocol modifications had demonstrated that change and tradition could coexist successfully when guided by clear principles of dignity, accessibility, and genuine service to the people. The final validation came in an unexpected form when several Republican politicians privately acknowledged that the monarchy's protocol reforms had strengthened rather than weakened the institution's public support. Even critics of royal privilege recognized that the changes demonstrated genuine commitment to inclusive values and responsive leadership. Charles closed his correspondence file that evening with deep satisfaction, knowing that his emotional struggles with bowing traditions had led to positive transformation that would benefit the monarchy and its relationship with citizens for generations to come. The royal family had successfully honored its past while embracing its future, creating a model of thoughtful evolution that preserved essential dignity while embracing necessary change.